curated by Martin Browen, which is, as the subtitle will tell you, Buddhism-inspired contemporary art. That doesn't mean that the artists are Buddhists, but they come from different cultures and explore the seminal ideas that are central to Buddhist philosophy, the notion of emptiness. Now, if you don't know what that is, the chances are, and we're hoping at least, that by the end of the evening you will. That's the point of this series. And I'm just thrilled that we have two pioneers in conversation this evening. One was a pioneer in bringing the teachings of Tibetan Buddhism to Australia, Tralek Rinpoche, and the other, Ken Burns, is a pioneer in that he's allowed us to view history in a whole other way. And so with those two different ways of viewing the world, we, I think, can explore nothingness with a very fresh approach this evening. Now, the format is a little bit different from what we normally do because we're going to screen two short films by Ken Burns of the philosopher and artist William Siegel. And so I'm not going to say very much about that, but it will provide the beginnings and the material by which Tralek Rinpoche and Ken Burns will have a conversation on emptiness and Buddhist philosophy. So I'm really, truly delighted and honored to be able to welcome Ken Burns to the Rubin Museum of Art. It's his debut. So welcome, Ken, and we really look forward to seeing your two films, and I hope you'll talk a little bit about them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. I just wanted to say at the outset how grateful I am to the Rubin Museum of Art and to Mr. Rubin, but particularly also to Marielle Bancu Siegel, William Siegel's widow and my dear friend, and Cynthia Reeves for me personally making this evening possible. And I'm very, very grateful that they're all here and that we could have a chance to be together this evening. I am showing two films of a trilogy that I made over 10 years' time on William Siegel. I had met William Siegel in the early 1970s as a teacher and student in the Gurdjieff studies, and later on had the great good fortune to become friends with him and his wife during the last 10 years of his life, during which time, in the midst of producing a number of films on our American history, I had the opportunity also to make 3 short films about William Siegel. To many people, they seem entirely incongruous from the rest of my body of work. In fact, I think that many of the same themes that inform these simple films also are engaged in our larger, more complicated, more intricate, perhaps more distracting films on American history. And I find some similarities there, and many of you who perhaps are familiar with my work might find that in that case here. In 1992, after getting to know the Siegels personally very well for about 3 years, I should back up and say in 1989, he had an exhibition of paintings. I had no idea that he was a painter. His wife had discovered up in an attic many of his paintings and had discovered herself that he had spent a long part of his life painting as an avocation, not a profession. And they were very, very interesting and seemed to be a window through which we could also help to understand his philosophy. In 1992, there was an exhibition planned in Tokyo, and Mrs. Siegel asked if I might produce a short film that might accompany the exhibition to help introduce Mr. Siegel to an Eastern Asian audience. And the result is the first film you're going to see, in which I think it is not so much the paintings, but a good deal of the underlying philosophy that informed William Siegel's life that comes through. And so I'd like to first show that film and then come up and introduce if I might very briefly again, the second film in the trilogy, and then we'll have an opportunity to have a conversation, and then hopefully there'll be some time at the end of the evening where we might entertain some responses or questions from you. So if we could show the first film, it's 13 minutes long. Thank you. Discovered. He was born in 1905 in Jim Crow South, Macon, Georgia, and died in the spring of 2000 as the cherry blossoms were starting to come out. He lived an extraordinarily full and rich life, and after this film came out, we spoke many times about it, and I had the great privilege of spending, as I said before, a lot of time with him and his wife over dinner. I had originally finished the first film, as you saw, without any sort of credit or copyright, and just assumed that it would go out in the world and people could appropriate it and claim that they'd made it, and that would be all right. And that would certainly be in the spirit of William Siegel's relationship, not just to the art, but to so many other things. And I remember one dinner he said, "Why didn't you put your name on the film? Why didn't you copyright it? That's ridiculous." And but beyond that admonition, we also spent a lot of time realizing that what had taken place in the collaboration was something that we wanted to continue, and we weren't quite sure how we were going to do it. Didn't know that it would eventually become a trilogy. But one year in 1995, I happened to be visiting Paris, where he and Marielle spent some part of the year, and it was a very cold January when they asked me if I would like to get up early on a Sunday morning and accompany them 3 hours to Vézelay, a beautiful basilica cathedral south of France, in the middle of central France, south of Paris. And we went there on this cold day to this extraordinary cathedral that had not yet experienced all the diminution that occurs in the great tourist attractions of Paris. What's happened to Chartres, what's happened to Notre Dame and Saint-Denis, as all of the inattention of centuries of tourism have kind of eroded the original intent. And Vézelay seemed very much alive with its original purpose. And as we toured that day, we began to realize that perhaps the next film subject might be on the notion of search. And Mr. Siegel readily agreed to that. And the particular basilica was run at that time by the Frères de Jerusalem, and one brother was taking us around and explained that the cathedral had been designed so that on the summer solstice the light came in through the top of the nave and spilled directly into the center of the nave in the aisle between the pews, or the chairs in this case, and that this was an important moment in the life of this cathedral each year. So we vowed to make an attempt to come back that following June, and we did. And we made a film. Now, you should understand that Mr. Siegel moved to New York at a relatively young age, went to NYU, became a track and football star, became a businessman, launched his own magazine, which at its time was about as far-thinking as any publication you have ever seen, called Gentry, which in the early 1950s was, I couldn't even describe what it is, a combination of Parabola and Esquire, and that it does only poor justice to what it was, decades ahead of its time, and its interest in esoteric philosophy, an esoteric philosophy that was brought on by an essential emptiness on his part, a desire for search, which he nurtured through an initial collaboration and intersection with the Gurdjieff work, working directly with Gurdjieff and his disciple P.D. Ouspensky for many, many years, but also became extraordinarily ecumenical. And after the Second World War, he spent a great deal of time in Japan, got to know D.T. Suzuki, and became really a student of Zen Buddhism, and helped to bring back to at least the Gurdjieff work and to these shores, not only a reliance on sitting, meditation, but also an unusual guided, spoken meditation, which he brought back and which many of us had the privilege to witness. And while we were making this film and in the months leading up to the second film, I asked him if I might once be able to film one of these meditations, and he would say no. And we proceeded over the course of several days to film at Vézelay at the time of the summer solstice, to continue to do an interview with him, as this film had. And then on the last morning, he relented. And at dawn, in the crypt where the bones of Mary Magdalene are supposed to reside, he permitted me to film a guided meditation, which serves as the sort of parentheses, the context in which this smaller film about Vézelay and this question of search, I felt could be undertaken. And we felt very fortunate to spend this time to have this with him and put together a film called Vézelay, which I'd like to share with you now, and I hope will, combined with the first film, untitled, though we call it for simplicity, William Siegel, and maybe sending you ahead in your own thoughts when I describe to you a little bit about the context of the third film, the conversation that we'll have afterwards. So could we run the second and final film? It is 30 minutes. I should probably just begin by telling you very briefly what the third film in the trilogy is, because in some ways it is as germane to the subject of our conversation as any one of them. In many of his painting work, Mr. Siegel, as you saw, really drunk in a lot of different styles. At one point, he followed the old Zen Buddhism story of the ox herding metaphor, these 10 panels, the search for enlightenment. And the third and final film of this trilogy, which was completed shortly after